You know how article headlines make it sound more controversial than it actually is? Well, this is exactly one of those articles. If you read just the headline, which is Dragon Age boss warns devs against listening to player feedback for solutions, I reckon your first reaction is probably going to be that he is full of shit. And then usually people don't even read the whole article, and then you have this vision of this person that might actually be completely skewed. Well, not to worry, because I read the whole article and I'm gonna tell you what exactly is this person talking about. But for starters, who is this former Dragon Age series producer? Well, his name is Mark Darrah. And if you read just the start of the article, it says that fellow game developers should absolutely listen to player feedback, but when it comes to identifying solutions to problems, it's best to look somewhere else. That's actually the exact quote in the article. And when you read the whole article, I actually think Mark Darrah's underlying point is mostly correct. The important distinction is that players are excellent at telling developers what's wrong, but they aren't necessarily the best people to decide how to fix it. And I would say that's a pretty important distinction. For example, let's take a look at a couple of examples. For starters, people might say stuff like combat is boring, or the world feels empty, or the dialogue isn't landing. And essentially that is extremely valuable information, but sometimes if you're giving solutions to certain problems, that might not be the best thing to do. In the article, Darrah gives a good example. Players might say enemy AI needs to be smarter, but the actual problem could be that enemies die too quickly, the encounters are poorly balanced, or pathfinding is broken. However, there is a big caveat. I personally think saying that players aren't developers can become dangerous if a studio uses it as an excuse to diminish criticism. And I would go even further saying that players don't really need to understand game development to recognize that something feels wrong. And I would say more often than not, players actually do identify the solution properly. One of the obvious examples is Baldur's Gate 3. Larian's early access period involved enormous amounts of player feedback, and plenty of changes were made based on what players experienced. The important part wasn't that Larian blindly implemented every suggestion. They used the feedback to refine their own decisions. And personally, that's the model I think everyone should be using, even if the headline of this article makes it sound more dismissive. Also, one interesting thing. The discussion around the article is already splitting along exactly these lines. Some people argue that players are good at identifying problems but not the solutions, while others point out that successful studios such as Larian and Digital Extremes have benefited enormously from community feedback. And this is where I think the Dragon Age angle gets interesting. Take Dragon Age 2 for example. One of the major criticisms was the excessive reuse of environments. And then Inquisition went in the opposite direction with enormous areas that could sometimes feel padded with relatively uninteresting content. So this basically gives you a great illustration of the difference between players don't like this and, well, if they didn't like it, we should do the exact opposite. And those aren't the same thing. The developer's job is to figure out why players didn't like it. And this is actually the part of the article I would definitely emphasize upon. Also, since I mentioned Dragon Age 2, it's rather obvious that the game didn't even reach, 30% of what Dragon Age Origins was. And if you dig a bit deeper, you can see what was going on with the Dragon Age 2 situation. They were basically rushed to make the game in 18 months or so, and technically speaking, it wasn't their fault, but the game is what the game is, so what can you do? You can criticize what you have in front of you and not what would have happened if they had the time, or taking into account that they only had 18 months to produce the game. That's not how these things work. There's a game, you play it, it's a finished product, it was published, and you give your opinion. So essentially, it's not simply black and white when it comes to development. But on the other hand, it's not the player's fault that the game was rushed and then we got what we got. And to be honest, that's a conversation for some other video. Anyway, to summarize, I would say developers should listen to players, like their patients describing their symptoms, And if the patient did their research in order to identify, or rather help you, the doctor, identify the problems easier, even better, because you don't need to do certain things and prolong the time to make a diagnosis. So a good approach would be, for example, that a huge number of players are experiencing this problem, and then you need to ask yourself why. What is actually causing it, and what's the best solution, while reading through the player feedback in order to identify stuff faster. And honestly, that's a much more interesting discussion than the headline itself. And that's basically my take on this news. Thanks very much for watching, and as always, like, share, subscribe, comment, all that good stuff. And that's it from me, until the next one.